She had been kneeling for so long that her legs had gone numb. The little girl's tears streamed silently down her face as her stepmother's cruel punishment continued without mercy. But nobody could have predicted what would happen when a passing millionaire witnessed this heartbreaking scene and raised his voice in outrage. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Autumn leaves drifted across the manicured lawns of Chesterville, a place where white columns and wraparound porches seemed to smile at passers-by. But beneath the picture-perfect exterior, secrets clung like morning mist to the grand old houses. Nowhere was this truer than at the Marblewood Conservatory of Etiquette and Excellence, where polished marble floors echoed with the soft footfalls of children being molded into society's elite. Annalise Holloway knelt in the empty east corridor, her small 7-year-old frame perfectly still despite the pain shooting through her legs. The marble beneath her was cold and unforgiving, but her posture remained impeccable, back straight, chin lifted, hands folded neatly in her lap. Her delicate features betrayed nothing, though her knees had long since gone from pink to angry red. 20 more minutes, Evelyn had whispered before gliding away to chat with Mrs. Tolliver, the headmistress. Until you learn proper decorum at formal events. The young girl's crime had been dropping a dessert fork during the conservatory's donor luncheon, a transgression her stepmother deemed unforgivable. Annalise had learned the rules of this punishment well over the past months. Tears would add another 15 minutes. Shifting position meant starting over. Complaints would result in additional lessons at home. So she remained motionless, her eyes fixed on a painting of Charleston Harbor across the hall, imagining herself sailing away on one of the tiny boats. The sound of approaching footsteps made her heart race, but it wasn't Evelyn returning. Instead, a girl about her age appeared, clutching sheet music and looking confused. "Why are you still kneeling?" the girl asked, tilting her head. "Everyone left the recital hall ages ago." Something in the simple question, the casual acknowledgement that what was happening wasn't normal, cracked Annalise's carefully maintained composure. Her lower lip trembled slightly. "My stepmom said I have to kneel until I learn not to embarrass her," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. Her voice was soft but laden with a weariness no child should possess. The girl's eyes widened. That's not right," she stammered, clearly uncertain what to do with this information. "Please don't tell," Annalise begged, panic rising in her chest. "She'll be angry if anyone knows." The girl hesitated, then nodded reluctantly before continuing down the hall, glancing back twice with worried eyes. What neither child realized was that this small exchange, this first confession, had sent the first tremor through Chesterville's carefully maintained facade. Like a hairline crack in fine porcelain, it would soon spread, threatening to shatter the gilded cage that held Annalise prisoner. Darius Holloway's unannounced visit to Marblewood Conservatory wasn't on anyone's calendar. The reclusive millionaire preferred it that way. Surprise inspections revealed truths that scheduled tours concealed. His leather shoes clicked against the polished marble floors as he moved through the hallways, nodding curtly at staff who recognized their secretive benefactor. The afternoon sun slanted through tall windows, casting long shadows across the corridor as Darius turned the corner. He stopped abruptly, his breath catching in his throat. There, alone in an alcove, knelt a small girl. Annalise's delicate frame trembled visibly, her hands folded perfectly in her lap as she maintained the punishing position. Her knees pressed against the cold marble, her face a mask of quiet suffering. The philanthropist stood frozen, watching as the child shifted slightly, wincing as she adjusted her weight. No adult supervised her. No one offered comfort. The scene transported him instantly to his own childhood, the silent punishments, the physical pain disguised as discipline. "My God," he whispered, his voice barely audible before something inside him snapped. Years of carefully maintained composure shattered like fine crystal. "Who did this to her?" Darius roared, his voice thunderous in the hushed hallway. The question echoed off marble walls and vaulted ceilings, bouncing through the corridors of Marblewood like a declaration of war. Annalise looked up, startled by the sudden intrusion, her eyes wide with fear and something else, perhaps hope, locked with his. She made no move to stand. Two teachers emerged from nearby classrooms, followed by a flustered Mrs. Tolliver. The headmistress hurried toward them, her heels clicking frantically against the floor. "Mr. Holloway, what an unexpected pleasure," she began, her practiced smile faltering as she assessed the situation. "Answer me," he demanded, gesturing toward the kneeling child. Who authorized this punishment? How long has she been here? The girl remained silent, her gaze now fixed on the floor. This is merely a standard disciplinary technique, Mrs. Tolliver explained, her voice lowered. Annalise's stepmother specifically requested we maintain certain standards of, get her up, now. His voice left no room for negotiation. As a teacher helped Annalise to her feet, Darius noticed her wince, the momentary flash of pain across her face as she straightened her legs. The sight ignited something primal within him, a protective fury that would change everything in Chesterville's carefully maintained social ecosystem. This moment, this single encounter in a sunlit hallway, would become the first tremor in an earthquake that would eventually topple the elegant veneer of Marblewood Conservatory and the community that enabled it. Darius Holloway's voice echoed through Marblewood's hallowed halls long after he'd stormed out. By morning, his actions spoke even louder than his words. The reclusive philanthropist had not only withdrawn his $1 million pledge, but had issued a formal statement to the Charleston Chronicle demanding a full investigation into the conservatory's disciplinary practices. "No child kneels on marble floors in any institution I support," he declared, his normally private persona thrust into uncomfortable spotlight. The phones at Marblewood began ringing incessantly as concerned parents sought reassurance. Mrs. Tolliver paced her office, crystal paperweight clutched in her trembling hand. "This is a misunderstanding," she repeated to each caller, her voice strained beneath its practiced composure. The headmistress summoned her board members for an emergency meeting, frantically drafting statements about Marblewood's impeccable reputation spanning 3 generations. Meanwhile, in her immaculate Chesterville home, Evelyn applied her lipstick with surgical precision. The stepmother had already contacted her own network of socialites, planting seeds of doubt about Darius's mental state. "He's always been unstable," she whispered over lunch at Harbor View Club. "Remember that episode at the governor's ball?" The women nodded, though none could recall any specific incident. By dessert, they'd convinced themselves they'd witnessed something concerning. Chesterville's elite quickly divided into factions. The old money families closed ranks around Evelyn, uncomfortable with the public airing of private matters. "Some discipline is necessary," they murmured behind crystal glasses. "Children need structure." Others, particularly younger parents, whispered support for Darius's stance. "About time someone said something," a father muttered at school pickup. Those etiquette classes always seemed excessive. For little Annalise, the world had suddenly tilted on its axis. Her classmates stared when she entered rooms. Teachers spoke to her with new gentleness. Even Mrs. Tolliver had patted her head awkwardly in the hallway, something that had never happened before. At home, Evelyn maintained perfect composure, but her eyes followed the child with calculating coldness. "We'll weather this storm," she told Annalise while brushing her hair with strokes just firm enough to sting. "Mr. Holloway will soon regret his interference." What Evelyn couldn't know was that Darius had already contacted Child Welfare Services and retained Patricia Winters, Charleston's most formidable family attorney. He sat in his study overlooking the harbor, remembering Annalise's trembling form on the marble floor. "I won't look away," he promised the empty room, his own childhood ghosts gathering in the shadows. "Not this time." Evelyn Holloway adjusted her pearl necklace with practiced precision as the Charleston Daily photographer positioned his camera. The living room of her Chesterville estate had been meticulously arranged. Fresh peonies, family photos prominently displayed, and not a cushion out of place. "I only want what's best for Annalise," she told the reporter, her voice catching with rehearsed emotion. "Being a stepmother is challenging, but I've embraced her as my own." The socialite dabbed at non-existent tears with a monogrammed handkerchief. "This Darius person, he doesn't know our family." He observed one moment of standard disciplinary practice and twisted it into something sinister. The journalist nodded sympathetically, exactly as Evelyn had anticipated. Chesterville's elite circles valued discretion above all else, and she knew precisely which strings to pull. By evening, 3 local publications had run sympathetic profiles portraying her as a dedicated guardian facing unwarranted scrutiny from an outsider. "Darius Holloway has a documented history of emotional instability," she whispered to Mrs. Tolliver over lunch at the Chesterville Country Club the following day. The headmistress leaned closer, eager for ammunition to protect Marblewood's reputation. "Did you know he was institutionalized briefly in his 20s? Not the sort of man who should be interfering with proper child-rearing." The whispers spread through Chesterville's manicured gardens and marble-floored kitchens like wildfire. Evelyn made strategic appearances at charity functions, accepting condolences for this unfortunate misunderstanding with gracious nods. But behind the mahogany doors of their home, Annalise faced a different reality. The punishments continued, now administered with calculated precision to leave no visible marks. "Kneel in your closet," the stepmother instructed one evening, voice eerily calm. "And remember, darling, this is our little secret. If you speak to that man again, I'll have to send you to boarding school overseas. Wouldn't that be dreadful?" The little girl's art supplies mysteriously disappeared. Her phone calls were monitored. Even her bedroom door lock was removed, for safety, Evelyn explained to William during their brief weekly calls, which she carefully supervised. At Marblewood, teachers noticed Annalise growing quieter, but when questioned, she recited perfect, practiced responses. "I'm just tired from studying so hard." The child had learned that silence was safer than truth. Meanwhile, Evelyn added another photograph to their mantel, herself kneeling beside Annalise at a church fundraiser, both smiling. The perfect stepmother and daughter. She made sure to point it out to every visitor, her arm draped possessively around the child's thin shoulders. "We're doing wonderfully," she would say, squeezing until Annalise winced. "Simply wonderfully." The old brick building on Maple Street looked nothing like Marblewood Conservatory, where Marblewood had been all polished marble and hushed corridors. Darius Holloway's youth center burst with color, walls covered in murals, sunlight streaming through tall windows, and the unmistakable sounds of children being children. "This is where you can be yourself," Darius told Annalise as he guided her through the entrance. The 7-year-old clutched her small backpack tightly, eyes wide as she took in the chaos of creativity around her. A group of children painted at easels while others molded clay at tables. No one stood in perfect posture or whispered politely. They laughed, they moved, they created. Genevieve Matthews approached them with a gentle smile. The art therapist's calm presence seemed to immediately put Annalise at ease. "Would you like to try drawing today?" she asked, kneeling to meet the child's eye level, not as punishment, but as respect. Annalise nodded, her delicate fingers relaxing their grip on her backpack. Genevieve led her to a table bathed in sunlight, where blank paper and colorful markers waited. The philanthropist watched from a distance, his expression softening, as Annalise picked up a blue marker with hesitation. "There are no wrong ways to draw here," Genevieve explained. "This isn't about being perfect." Those words seemed to unlock something in Annalise. Her first strokes were timid, barely visible on the paper, but as minutes passed, her lines grew bolder. She reached for red, then yellow, then black. The therapist observed silently, noting how the child's body language transformed, shoulders relaxing, breathing deepening. By the end of that first session, Annalise had filled 3 pages. Her drawings were abstract, chaotic swirls of color that seemed to tell stories only she understood. But Genevieve recognized the significance. This wasn't just art, it was communication. "She's expressing trauma through color," she told Darius later, after Annalise had been picked up. "The repetitive patterns, the heavy black borders, she's processing her experiences." Over the next few weeks, Annalise became a regular at the center. Her drawings evolved, becoming more structured, more intentional. She began adding symbols, a small figure kneeling, a larger figure standing, windows with bars. Each image was coded, layered with meaning that gradually revealed her inner world. "Look," she whispered to Genevieve one afternoon, pointing to a bright yellow sun she had drawn in the corner of a particularly dark image. "That's hope?" Darius, watching from his office doorway, felt his chest tighten. In this sunlit room, surrounded by art supplies and gentle guidance, Annalise was finding her voice. Not through words, but through colors and shapes that spoke volumes. It was just the beginning, but for the first time since he had seen her kneeling on that cold marble floor, Darius believed healing was possible. Genevieve watched in quiet amazement as Annalise Holloway's paintbrush moved across the canvas with increasing confidence. What had begun as tentative strokes 2 weeks ago had evolved into bold, deliberate expressions. The 7-year-old's latest piece featured a towering figure, faceless but unmistakably feminine, standing over a small girl kneeling on what appeared to be a cold floor. The child in the painting had knees tinged with purple and blue, her face downturned, but her eyes unmistakably alive. "Can you tell me about this one?" the art therapist asked, careful to maintain the gentle tone that had gradually earned Annalise's trust. The child hesitated, then pointed to the kneeling figure. "That's me, when I'm being corrected," she whispered. And that's... She trailed off, her finger hovering near the looming shadow. Genevieve nodded, understanding flowing between them without requiring names. Your art is telling a story that might be hard to say with words, she offered. That's very brave. Over the next sessions, the art therapist introduced Annalise to different mediums, charcoal, pastels, even clay, encouraging her to explore how each could express different feelings. The girl took to symbolism naturally, developing a visual language where red spirals meant fear, blue dots signified tears never shed, and birds represented freedom still out of reach. Darius visited often, his presence at the youth center becoming a reassuring constant. He never pushed Annalise to explain her artwork, but his eyes lingered on each new piece, his jaw tightening at the stories they told. She's creating evidence, he confided to Genevieve one afternoon, voice low as they watched Annalise from across the room. More powerful than any testimony. What neither adult realized was that Annalise had begun sharing her techniques. During free time, she would huddle with other girls, teaching them how to hide messages in seemingly innocent drawings. If you make the sun this way, she would demonstrate, it means you're scared at home. If you draw hands like this, it means someone hurt you. A small, silent network formed among the children. Some had their own stories of harsh words or rough handling. Others simply wanted to belong to this secret language of solidarity. They exchanged drawings like coded messages, understanding each other in ways the adults couldn't yet comprehend. One afternoon, Annalise completed a triptych, 3 panels showing a girl kneeling, then standing, then flying. She signed it with her full name for the first time. This is important, she told Genevieve, her voice stronger than it had ever been. This is what happened, what's happening, and what will happen. The art therapist nodded, recognizing that these images would soon speak volumes in the battle for Annalise's future, a testimony more authentic than any adult statement could ever be. Evelyn Holloway's perfectly manicured nails tapped against the mahogany desk as her attorney outlined the lawsuit. Her eyes, cold as Charleston Harbor in January, narrowed at the mention of Darius's name. The papers before her accused the philanthropist of emotional manipulation, defamation, and interfering with parental authority, all carefully crafted charges designed to paint him as an unstable outsider, meddling in family matters. He has no right, she hissed, signing the documents with a flourish. Annalise is my responsibility, not his. Within 24 hours, Darius received the legal notice at his office. The millionaire stood by the window, papers clutched in his hand, watching children play freely in the yard of his youth center. The lawsuit didn't surprise him. He had anticipated Evelyn's retaliation, but the viciousness of the allegations did. She claimed he was psychologically damaging Annalise by encouraging false narratives about her home life. Meanwhile, at Marblewood Conservatory, Headmistress Tolliver called an emergency staff meeting. The elegant woman paced the faculty lounge, her voice low but firm. Any inquiries about the Holloway situation are to be directed to me personally, she instructed. We cannot afford speculation or gossip. Marblewood's reputation must remain unblemished. What she didn't mention was how she'd already buried 3 separate incident reports from teachers who had noticed Annalise's bruised knees. One young instructor opened her mouth to speak, but caught Mrs. Tolliver's warning glance and remained silent. The whisper campaign against Darius began subtly. At charity galas and country club luncheons, Evelyn's friends murmured about his troubled past and questionable motives. Why would a bachelor take such interest in a little girl? Wasn't there something unsettling about his intensity, his reclusiveness? I heard he was institutionalized as a teenager, one socialite whispered over champagne. Apparently, he's obsessed with saving children because he couldn't save himself, added another. Darius felt the social walls closing in. Invitations dwindled. Donors to his youth programs began asking uncomfortable questions. Even Genevieve noticed the change, bringing him coffee one morning with concern in her eyes. They're trying to isolate you, she said quietly. He nodded, staring at the legal documents spread across his desk. I expected this. Evelyn won't stop until she regains complete control. Will you back down? The art therapist asked. Darius looked up, his expression hardening with resolve. I spent 15 years of my childhood silent and afraid. I won't let Annalise spend even 15 more days that way. That evening he called his attorney and doubled the legal team's budget. If Evelyn wanted war, she would have one, but unlike the battles of his childhood, this time he intended to win. The manila envelope arrived at Darius Holloway's legal office unmarked except for a single word: truth. Inside, his attorney found a weathered, leather-bound journal with dates spanning 3 years, the exact period Annalise had lived under Evelyn's care. The handwriting was neat, methodical, belonging to Martha Jenkins, who had served as the family's housekeeper until her abrupt dismissal last spring. "I kept this record because no one would believe me otherwise," read the attached note. "I couldn't stay silent anymore." Darius's hands trembled as he turned the pages. Martha had documented everything, Annalise kneeling for hours while Evelyn entertained guests in the next room, the child being denied meals for slouching, ice-cold baths administered as punishment for speaking too loudly. The housekeeper had noted dates, durations, and the girl's physical state afterward, details too specific to fabricate. "This changes everything," whispered the philanthropist, passing the journal to his attorney. The documentation provided what they'd lacked: a consistent third-party witness to the pattern of abuse. That same evening, an email arrived in Darius's personal inbox with the subject line, "About my sister and my niece." The sender identified herself as Miriam Caldwell, Evelyn's estranged sister. "I've been searching for Annalise for years," the message read. "Evelyn cut all family ties after marrying William. What you need to know is that this isn't her first instance of controlling behavior. There were incidents at the finishing school where she worked, complaints that were buried. I have documentation if you're willing to meet." The reclusive millionaire stared at his device, realizing the case was expanding beyond what anyone had imagined. He forwarded the email to his legal team, instructing them to verify Miriam's identity while maintaining absolute discretion. At the courthouse the following morning, Evelyn appeared perfectly composed in a cream-colored suit, her smile never wavering as reporters called questions. But when Darius's attorney requested a special hearing to introduce new evidence, her facade cracked momentarily, a flash of panic crossing her features before she regained control. "We have a witness willing to testify," announced the attorney, and documented evidence of systematic emotional and physical abuse. For the first time since the proceedings began, the socialite looked genuinely rattled. She whispered urgently to her lawyer, who requested an immediate recess. Meanwhile, across town at the youth center, Genevieve watched Annalise work on a new drawing, this one showing a small figure stepping out of shadows into light. The art therapist smiled gently, recognizing that even as adults fought battles in courtrooms, the child was already charting her own path toward healing. The Charleston Herald's front page left nothing to the imagination. Holloway's crusade, personal vendetta, or justice. The article detailed Darius Holloway's own childhood at Westbrook Academy, a boarding school shuttered 15 years ago after investigations revealed systematic abuse disguised as discipline. Former students had testified about kneeling on rice for hours, isolation in windowless rooms, and public humiliation, all in the name of character building. "This explains everything," Evelyn told reporters outside the courthouse, her voice perfectly modulated to convey concern rather than triumph. "Mr. Holloway is projecting his own trauma onto my stepdaughter's normal upbringing. It's tragic, but it makes his interference understandable, if misguided." In his Chesterville estate, Darius paced the study, phone pressed to his ear. "They've found Westbrook." "Yes, all of it." He listened to his attorney's advice, then sighed. "No, I won't deny anything." Let them dig. The philanthropist had never spoken publicly about those 4 years. The memories still visited him at night. The headmaster's study with its leather strap hanging prominently on the wall, the sound of knees hitting hardwood, the silence expected during punishments. He recognized in Annalise's posture, in her careful movements, reflections of his younger self. That evening, 3 former Westbrook students contacted Darius's office, offering testimonies about their own recoveries. One was now a child psychologist specializing in institutional trauma. "Your past doesn't disqualify you," she wrote. "It makes you uniquely qualified to recognize what others pretend not to see." In court the next day, Evelyn's attorney presented enlarged photographs of teenage Darius at Westbrook, standing rigidly in uniform. "Your Honor, Mr. Holloway's crusade is about his own unresolved issues, not about Annalise's welfare." When Darius took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. "Yes, I attended Westbrook. Yes, I experienced what you're implying." His voice remained steady. "That's precisely why I recognized Annalise's pain when everyone else chose to look away. The adults who should have protected me didn't. I refused to be that adult for her." Genevieve testified next, explaining how trauma survivors often develop heightened awareness of others' suffering. Mr. Holloway's background doesn't undermine his concerns, it validates them. He saw what trained educators claim to miss. Outside the courthouse, public opinion began shifting. Parents who had initially sided with Evelyn reconsidered. Several Marblewood board members privately contacted Darius, admitting they'd ignored warning signs about Evelyn's methods. That night, Annalise handed Darius a drawing, two figures standing together, facing shadowy shapes. "Is this us?" he asked gently. She nodded. "Fighting our monsters together." For the first time in decades, Darius felt his past might serve a purpose beyond pain. The ghosts weren't gone, but perhaps they could help guide him, and Annalise, toward healing. The autumn light faded early as Darius Holloway locked up the youth center. Most children had already been picked up, but Annalise remained, sitting cross-legged on a beanbag chair, her small hands clutching something tightly. "I found something," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the heating system. "In my dollhouse." Darius knelt beside her, careful to maintain the respectful distance Genevieve had advised for trauma survivors. The philanthropist had learned that patience often yielded more than questions. Annalise's fingers uncurled to reveal a folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges and creased from being hidden. It was behind the tiny bathroom mirror. "I never looked there before." The letter was unsigned, but written in a distinctly masculine hand, neat cursive that slanted slightly right. Darius recognized it immediately from the documents in Annalise's case file. It belonged to William, her father, a man who had seemingly abandoned his daughter to Evelyn's cruel care. "May I?" Darius asked gently. The child nodded, relinquishing the paper while keeping her eyes fixed on it, as if afraid it might disappear. The letter was brief, but devastating in its implications. "If you're reading this, something has happened. Know that I never intended to leave you alone with her. In case of emergency, I've arranged for your custody to transfer to my cousin Margaret. The documents are with my attorney, James Whitfield. I love you always." Darius looked up, meeting Annalise's wide eyes. "Do you know who Margaret is?" She shook her head. "Dad never talked about his family. Evelyn says they all abandoned him." The revelation changed everything. Not only had William planned for Annalise's protection, but he'd never legally granted Evelyn guardianship rights. The stepmother had simply assumed control when William disappeared, leveraging her marriage certificate and social connections to maintain the illusion of authority. "This is important," Darius explained, choosing his words carefully. "Your father wanted to make sure you were safe." Tears welled in Annalise's eyes. "Then why did he go away?" Darius had no answer, but the letter provided something perhaps more valuable: leverage. If William had made legal arrangements for Annalise's care, Evelyn's position was far more precarious than anyone had realized. That evening, Darius contacted his legal team. By morning, they had located James Whitfield, now retired in Florida. The attorney confirmed the existence of custody documents and expressed shock that they had never been executed. "William never contacted me," Whitfield explained over the phone. "I assumed the worst." The discovery reopened the legal battle with new urgency. Evelyn's authority over Annalise now rested on increasingly shaky ground, a house of cards built on assumptions rather than legal standing. For Annalise, the letter meant something else entirely: proof that her father had not willingly abandoned her to her stepmother's cruelty. Dr. Eleanor Winters placed her report on the desk with a deliberate tap. The pediatrician's findings were unequivocal. Annalise had developed peripheral neuropathy in both knees, a condition rarely seen in children her age. The damage to the nerves was consistent with prolonged kneeling on hard surfaces, exactly as the little girl had described. "These aren't temporary bruises," Dr. Winters explained to Darius Holloway and his legal team. "This is permanent nerve damage that will require physical therapy. The pattern indicates repeated trauma over months, possibly years." The medical evidence transformed the case overnight. What had been dismissed by some as exaggeration now had clinical validation. Darius felt vindicated, yet devastated. He stared at the medical diagrams, each marking on Annalise's knees, represented by clinical dots and lines that couldn't begin to capture her suffering. "Will she recover completely?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The doctor hesitated. "With proper care, most of the sensation should return, but some damage may be permanent." Across town, Marblewood Conservatory faced its own reckoning. The State Education Board had launched a comprehensive review following Darius's public allegations. Investigators uncovered a troubling pattern. 6 separate complaints about Evelyn's behavior during her visits to the school had been filed over the past 2 years. Each report described similar incidents: children left kneeling, standing in corners for hours, or being verbally humiliated. Mrs. Tolliver sat rigid in her office as the board representative placed the complaint files before her. Each folder had been marked "resolved" in her own handwriting, yet no action had ever been taken. "You buried these," the investigator stated flatly. "Why?" The headmistress smoothed her skirt, buying time. "The Marblewood reputation takes precedence over child welfare?" The investigator interrupted. For the first time, Mrs. Tolliver's carefully constructed facade cracked. Her hands trembled as she admitted, "Evelyn is connected to half our board members. Her family has funded our East Wing. I convinced myself these were exaggerations." That evening, Darius received a call from his attorney. "The school's cooperating now. Tolliver's testimony alone could be enough, but with the medical evidence—" He paused. "Evelyn's losing allies by the hour." Darius watched through the window as Annalise sat in the garden, sketching quietly. The medical report had confirmed what her art had been saying all along. The truth was finally emerging, not just about Evelyn's cruelty, but about an entire system that had protected her at the expense of a child's well-being. "Make sure the judge sees everything," Darius said. "Every report, every drawing, every medical finding. No more hiding." The courtroom fell silent as Genevieve carefully arranged Annalise's drawings on the evidence board. What had begun as therapy exercises at Darius Holloway's youth center now stood as the most compelling testimony in the case. The art therapist stepped back, allowing the images to speak their truth to the packed room. Judge Winters leaned forward, studying the pictures with narrowed eyes. "The court would like to hear from the child about these drawings," she said, her voice gentle but firm. Annalise walked to the stand, her small frame dwarfed by the witness box. She wore a simple blue dress, her hands trembling slightly as she was sworn in. Darius watched from his seat, his face a mask of controlled emotion. "Can you tell us about this first drawing?" Annalise's attorney asked, pointing to a stark image of a tall, faceless woman looming over a tiny figure on the ground. "That's when I had to kneel for 3 hours because I spilled punch at Mrs. Tolliver's garden party," the child explained, her voice barely audible. "The floor was marble. It was cold." The attorney nodded encouragingly. "And this one with the red circles? Those are my knees after. They hurt so much I couldn't sleep." Annalise pointed to another drawing. "This is the closet where I had to stay when guests came, if I couldn't stop crying." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Evelyn shifted in her seat, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her designer handbag. The most disturbing drawing showed a small figure surrounded by what looked like shattered glass. "That's me inside," Annalise explained with unexpected clarity. "The broken parts are how I felt when she told everyone I was making things up for attention." Mrs. Tolliver, seated behind Evelyn, stared at the floor, unable to meet anyone's gaze. When the prosecutor approached with the final drawing, a child kneeling before a clock with impossibly long hands, Annalise's voice strengthened. "This is how time feels when you're being punished. It never ends." Genevieve testified next, explaining the therapeutic significance of the artwork. "Children often communicate trauma through symbols when words fail them," she explained. The consistency in Annalise's imagery indicates these aren't fabrications but documented memories. The pediatrician's report was entered into evidence alongside the drawings, confirming the nerve damage in Annalise's knees, physical proof corroborating her artistic testimony. From his seat beside William, Darius watched as Annalise's art transformed from private healing to public reckoning. The little girl who had once been silenced was now being heard through every line, every color, every painful memory captured on paper. When Evelyn's attorney attempted to dismiss the drawings as childish imagination, the judge silenced him with a raised hand. "The court finds these images speak with remarkable clarity," she said, her gaze lingering on Annalise's trembling form. "And we are listening." The courtroom fell silent as Darius Holloway's attorney presented the documents with steady hands. "Your Honor, we've uncovered critical evidence that Mrs. Evelyn never completed the legal guardianship process for Annalise following her marriage to William. She has been exercising authority she was never granted." Judge Lancaster adjusted her glasses, examining the paperwork with narrowed eyes. The revelation sent ripples through the gallery. Evelyn's perfectly composed facade cracked slightly, a tightening around her mouth, a twitch beneath her right eye. "This means," continued the attorney, that all decisions regarding Annalise's education, medical care, and discipline were made without proper legal standing. Annalise sat beside Genevieve, the art therapist's hand protectively covering hers. The young girl's eyes widened as she processed what this meant. The woman who had controlled every aspect of her life had been doing so without any right. Outside the courthouse, the news spread through Chesterville like wildfire. The carefully constructed image Evelyn had maintained began to unravel thread by thread. Her smartphone buzzed constantly with cancellations, charity committee meetings, country club luncheons, fundraiser planning sessions. "I simply can't be associated with this situation," whispered Margaret Whitfield, once Evelyn's closest ally, as she declined an invitation to tea. The social isolation was swift and merciless. The very weapon Evelyn had wielded against others now turned against her. More surprising were the anonymous letters arriving at Darius's office. "I was made to stand in a closet for hours when I spilled punch at Evelyn's Christmas gala," wrote one woman. "My daughter was uninvited from Annalise's birthday because her dress wasn't appropriate," shared another. Each letter revealed a pattern of control and humiliation extending far beyond Annalise. Miriam, Annalise's grandmother, reviewed these testimonies with a heavy heart. "The patterns match exactly what I witnessed before I was pushed out of their lives," she told Darius over coffee at his youth center. "Evelyn learned these techniques from somewhere. They're too systematic to be random cruelty." At Marblewood Conservatory, Mrs. Tolliver faced her own reckoning as parents demanded answers about her complicity. The headmistress found herself increasingly isolated, her reputation for excellence now overshadowed by questions about her judgment. For Annalise, the revelation brought both confusion and relief. During her next art therapy session, she painted a birdcage with an open door, the bird still inside but looking toward the opening. "She's afraid to fly out," Annalise explained to Genevieve, her small fingers tracing the cage bars. "But she knows she can now." The legal team prepared for the next hearing, knowing that without guardianship, Evelyn's house of cards was finally collapsing. The truth, so long buried beneath Chesterville's polished veneer, was finally emerging, one painful revelation at a time. The courtroom fell silent as the attorney slid the yearbook across the polished table. Darius Holloway stared at the faded photograph, his fingers trembling slightly as they traced the outline of a much younger Evelyn standing behind a row of uniformed children at Westridge Academy. "You recognize this institution, Mr. Holloway?" the attorney asked. Darius nodded slowly. "I spent 3 years there." His voice, usually commanding, sounded hollow. "The same place where I learned to stand perfectly still for hours or face the consequences." The revelation sent ripples through the courtroom. Westridge Academy, the prestigious boarding school with its sterling reputation and shadowy disciplinary practices, connected these two adversaries in ways no one had anticipated. But while Darius had been a student, the records showed Evelyn had served as an assistant to the infamous headmistress Blackwood, known for her character-building punishments. "She wasn't a victim," Genevieve whispered to William as they watched from the gallery. "She was part of the system that hurt children like Darius." That evening, alone in his study, the philanthropist poured himself a drink, staring at old newspaper clippings about Westridge's eventual closure following abuse allegations. The connection explained so much. Evelyn's obsession with posture, with silence, with breaking spirits under the guise of building character. She had learned from masters of the craft. "Are you fighting for Annalise or for yourself?" Miriam asked him gently when she brought him tea later that night. The grandmother's eyes held no judgment, only concern. "I don't know anymore," he admitted. The lines between past and present had blurred. Every time he saw Annalise kneeling, was he seeing himself? Was this crusade for justice or vengeance against a system that had scarred him? The next morning, Mrs. Tolliver provided testimony that chilled the courtroom. "Evelyn frequently referenced her time at Westridge. She once told me children need to be broken like horses to achieve greatness." The headmistress looked down, shame evident in her posture. "I should have recognized the warning signs." For Annalise, watching from beside her father, the adults' conversation seemed distant and confusing, but she understood enough to draw a new picture that evening. A small boy and a small girl, separated by a wall, but reaching toward each other. "Is this you and Mr. Darius?" Genevieve asked softly when the child showed her the drawing. Annalise nodded. "We both know about the kneeling," she said simply. The revelation transformed the case from a single instance of abuse to something far more insidious, a cycle of institutional cruelty passing from generation to generation. And for Darius, it raised the most difficult question of all. Could he separate his mission to save Annalise from his need to heal his own wounded past? The revelation came like a thunderclap during the third week of proceedings. Financial forensic experts hired by Darius Holloway's legal team uncovered a disturbing pattern in Annalise's trust fund management. Evelyn had been systematically transferring money, nearly $200,000 over 3 years, into her personal accounts, disguising the transactions as educational expenses and therapeutic interventions that never actually occurred. The trust was established by William specifically for his daughter's future, explained the financial investigator to the stunned courtroom. Instead, it funded spa retreats, designer wardrobes, and country club memberships, all while Annalise wore the same 3 outfits on rotation. Evelyn's carefully constructed facade crumbled as bank statements were entered into evidence. The woman who had lectured Annalise on propriety and perfection had been committing fraud, using her stepdaughter's inheritance to maintain the illusion of old money elegance. Her attorney attempted to characterize the transfers as administrative oversights, but the meticulous documentation of her spending told a different story. The Charleston District Attorney's Office announced formal charges of financial fraud the following morning. Television crews descended on Chesterville, their vans lining the manicured streets where Evelyn had once been welcomed with champagne flutes and air kisses. "I always thought something was off about her," whispered Margaret Beaumont, who had hosted Evelyn at her annual garden party just 2 months prior. The way she'd talk about Annalise, so possessive, yet so cold. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. The same social circle that had averted their eyes from Annalise's suffering now rushed to condemn her stepmother. Invitations to Evelyn's charity luncheon were suddenly lost in the mail. Text messages went unanswered. The Society columnist who had once described her as Charleston's most devoted stepmother now penned a scathing piece about wolves in cashmere clothing. At Marblewood Conservatory, Mrs. Tolliver faced her own reckoning. Parents demanded explanations for the institution's failure to protect a vulnerable student. Board members called emergency meetings, distancing themselves from both the headmistress and her friendship with Evelyn. Miriam, watching from the gallery each day, noted the shifting allegiances with a grim satisfaction. "They're abandoning her now, but they enabled her for years," she told Darius quietly. "This town worships at the altar of appearances." For Annalise, the financial revelations brought a strange validation. The child had always sensed the contradiction between Evelyn's public generosity and private cruelty. Now everyone could see the truth, that beneath the polished exterior lived a woman willing to steal from a child while forcing her to kneel for imagined imperfections. Perfection, it seemed, had come at a price. Chesterville was no longer willing to pay. The auditorium of Marblewood Conservatory buzzed with anticipation as parents clutched programs and adjusted camera settings on their devices. The spring recital had always been a highlight of the school calendar, with students performing musical pieces they had practiced for months. Annalise sat backstage, her small fingers trembling slightly as she smoothed the pleats of her performance dress. Genevieve had helped her practice deep breathing techniques for moments like this, and the young girl closed her eyes, inhaling slowly. "You'll be wonderful," whispered Darius Holloway, who had arrived early to offer moral support. The philanthropist had become a steady presence in her life, his unwavering belief in her abilities giving Annalise courage she never knew she possessed. When her name was announced, Annalise walked to the grand piano with practiced poise. The spotlight felt warm against her skin as she settled onto the bench, positioning her hands above the keys. The opening notes of Debussy's Clair de Lune filled the hall, her interpretation delicate yet confident. For 3 minutes she was transported, free from memories of cold marble floors and whispered threats. Then she saw her. Evelyn stood at the back of the auditorium, having slipped in after the lights dimmed. The socialite's face was partially shadowed, but Annalise recognized the familiar tilt of her head, the calculating stillness of her posture. Their eyes met across the distance, and suddenly Annalise's fingers faltered. The music stuttered, then stopped. The audience shifted uncomfortably as the girl froze, her face draining of color. Memories flooded back, kneeling for hours, Evelyn's voice hissing about embarrassment and failure. The room began to spin, faces blurring into indistinct shapes. Annalise tried to breathe as Genevieve had taught her, but her lungs seemed to collapse. "I can't," she whispered into the microphone before her small body crumpled sideways off the bench. The thud of her fall echoed through the shocked silence. Then chaos erupted. Darius vaulted onto the stage while Mrs. Tolliver rushed forward, her usual composure fractured by genuine alarm. Parents gasped and murmured as the headmistress called for the school nurse. "Give her space!" Darius commanded, cradling Annalise's head as she began to regain consciousness. When the girl's eyes fluttered open, she whispered one word: "Stepmom." That single word rippled through the gathered crowd. Parents who had previously dismissed rumors about Evelyn's methods exchanged troubled glances. The community that had maintained polite silence for generations found itself confronting an uncomfortable truth displayed on their prestigious stage. By morning, calls flooded the school board. Parents demanded answers, and for the first time, Chesterville's elite began questioning the price of perfection they had long accepted without complaint. The revelation came during a quiet afternoon at Darius Holloway's office. His cybersecurity team had finally traced the anonymous emails to a small apartment in Savannah. The sender wasn't some shadowy investigator or vengeful former employee of Evelyn's. It was Miriam Caldwell, Annalise's maternal grandmother, who had been searching for her granddaughter for 3 years. "I lost contact after William married that woman," Miriam explained the following day, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her handbag. The elderly woman's eyes, remarkably similar to Annalise's, darted nervously around Darius's office. "Evelyn systematically cut off all family connections. I hired private investigators, but she's very good at maintaining appearances." Darius leaned forward, instantly recognizing an ally. "Mrs. Caldwell, your timing couldn't be better. The court case has reached a critical point. Miriam's testimony proved invaluable. She brought family albums, birthday cards returned unopened, and documentation of multiple attempts to maintain contact with her granddaughter. More damning was her knowledge of Evelyn's troubled past, incidents from her daughter's youth that established a pattern of controlling behavior and image obsession long before Annalise entered the picture. "My daughter was always difficult," Miriam confessed to the judge, her voice steady despite the pain evident in her expression. "But I never imagined she would inflict such cruelty on a child." With Miriam's emotional and financial support bolstering their case, Darius accelerated plans for his Empathy Academy. What began as a youth arts program expanded into a full alternative school, housed in a renovated Victorian mansion on the outskirts of Chesterville. The grandmother threw herself into the project, offering insights on curriculum and even volunteering to teach music. On opening day, Annalise walked through the doors as the academy's first official student. Gone was the rigid posture and fearful glances. The little girl still moved carefully, her knees not fully healed, but she smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes, as Genevieve showed her the art studio designed with her input. "No kneeling here," Darius promised, showing her the cushioned window seats and beanbag chairs scattered throughout the building. "This is a place where children learn to be themselves." Miriam watched her granddaughter explore the building, tears glistening in her eyes. "I've missed so much," she whispered to Darius. He nodded, understanding the weight of time lost. "But you're here now," he replied. "And that's what matters to her." That evening, Annalise sat between her grandmother and Darius at dinner, belonging somewhere at last, the first true family she'd known since her mother's death. The courtroom fell silent as the doors swung open. A thin man with tired eyes and an uneven gait made his way down the center aisle, leaning heavily on a cane. William Holloway had returned from the shadows, his unexpected presence sending ripples through the proceedings. Annalise froze when she saw him. For months she had believed her father had abandoned her, another adult who had chosen to disappear. Darius placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder as William approached, his eyes never leaving his daughter's face. "I've been in a hospital in Switzerland," William explained to the judge, his voice raspy from disuse. "A car accident left me with severe injuries. I had no idea what was happening to my daughter." The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Medical records were presented showing William had suffered traumatic injuries requiring multiple surgeries and extended rehabilitation. More damning were the phone records revealing dozens of calls he had made to his home, calls that Evelyn had intercepted and hidden from Annalise. "She told me you didn't want to talk to me," Annalise whispered when her father knelt before her, wincing from his own pain. "She said you went away because I wasn't good enough." William's eyes filled with tears. "I would never leave you by choice," he said, his voice breaking. "Never." Evelyn sat rigid at the defense table, her perfect posture betraying nothing, while her attorney frantically whispered in her ear. The evidence was mounting. Not only had she abused Annalise, but she had deliberately isolated the child from her father, while siphoning funds from the trust established for the girl's care. When asked about his intentions, William stood with difficulty. "I am not yet well enough to provide the full-time care my daughter deserves," he admitted. "But I am well enough to see who has truly protected her." He turned toward Darius. "This man stood up when I could not. He saw my daughter's pain when everyone else looked away. I formally request that Darius Holloway be named Annalise's co-guardian until my recovery is complete." Genevieve, sitting behind them, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Miriam reached across to squeeze her hand, both women watching as years of deception unraveled before them. The judge asked Annalise what she wanted. The little girl looked between her father and Darius, then at the sketchbook clutched in her hands, the one where she had drawn her father returning countless times. "I want to go home with both of them," she said simply. William embraced his daughter for the first time in nearly a year, while Darius stepped back, giving them space for their reunion. The philanthropist caught Evelyn's ice-cold stare from across the room, but for once, her hatred held no power over anyone in that courtroom. The courthouse fell silent as Judge Eleanor Winters turned to Annalise. "Young lady, would you like to say anything before I make my decision?" The 7-year-old girl looked up at Darius Holloway, who gave her a gentle nod of encouragement. Annalise rose from her seat, clutching a small handmade book to her chest. Her voice, though soft, carried clearly through the hushed courtroom. "I wrote something," she said, opening the book with careful fingers. The pages contained both words and illustrations, vibrant colors framing simple, powerful text. "Once there was a girl who was told to kneel until she became perfect," she read, her eyes fixed on the pages rather than the adults watching her. "But she never did, because she was already enough." William wiped tears from his eyes as his daughter continued reading. The story, crafted during her sessions with Genevieve, told of a bird trapped in a beautiful cage who finally found the courage to sing. When Annalise finished, she closed the book and looked directly at the judge for the first time. "I don't want to kneel anymore," she said simply. Judge Winters removed her glasses, visibly moved. "Thank you, Annalise. That was very brave." The ruling came swiftly after that. The judge awarded full custody to William, with Darius named as interim guardian until William's medical recovery was complete. Evelyn was formally removed from all trusts and financial accounts associated with Annalise. "Furthermore," Judge Winters added, her tone hardening, "I am recommending charges of emotional abuse and financial misconduct be pursued against Mrs. Evelyn Holloway, with additional investigation into her role at Marblewood Conservatory." Evelyn's face, perfectly composed throughout the proceedings, finally cracked. "This is absurd," she hissed, rising to her feet. "That child needs discipline, not coddling. You're all making a terrible mistake." Her attorney placed a restraining hand on her arm, but Evelyn shook it off. Without another word, she gathered her designer handbag and stormed toward the exit. The sharp click of her heels echoed through the silent courtroom, each step punctuating her defeat. Miriam, seated in the back row, watched her daughter leave without attempting to stop her. Her focus remained on Annalise, who had returned to William's side. As the courtroom began to empty, Darius approached the bench to thank Judge Winters. The philanthropist's shoulders, tense for months, finally relaxed as he glanced back at Annalise, now safely nestled between her father and grandmother. "It's over," Genevieve whispered, joining him. "She's free." Darius nodded, watching as Annalise smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes for the first time since he'd found her kneeling on that cold marble floor. Spring had blossomed in Chesterville, bringing with it a sense of renewal that seemed perfectly timed. Annalise stepped through the doors of the Empathy Academy with a lightness in her movements that had been absent for so long. The marble floors of Marblewood were now just a fading memory, replaced by the warm wooden planks beneath her bare feet. The young girl twirled across the sunlit studio, her laughter mingling with the sounds of other children. No longer did she fold herself into corners or measure her words with careful precision. Instead, Annalise danced freely, arms outstretched, face tilted toward the ceiling-high windows where dust motes sparkled in the afternoon light. "Look what I've started," she called to Genevieve, rushing over with pages clutched in her small hands. The art therapist smiled warmly, taking the offered sheets with genuine interest. What had begun as coded drawings of pain had transformed into vibrant illustrations. For a children's book, The Girl Who Found Her Voice. "These are beautiful," the therapist whispered, studying the colorful pages where a character remarkably like Annalise journeyed from darkness into light. "You've captured exactly how it feels to be free." From the doorway, Darius Holloway watched silently. The philanthropist leaned against the frame, arms crossed, his expression softened by something that looked remarkably like peace. The nightmares that had plagued him since his own childhood had begun to quiet. In helping Annalise find her way out of silence, he too had found healing. William joined him, moving slowly with his cane, but smiling broadly at the sight of his daughter. "I never thought I'd see her like this again," Annalise's father murmured, "when I woke up in that hospital overseas, not knowing if I'd ever make it back." "But you did," Darius reminded him, "and now you both have a second chance." Across the room, Miriam sat with several children, her silver hair catching the light as she helped them with their own art projects. The grandmother had moved to a small house just minutes from William and Annalise, determined to make up for lost time. Genevieve gathered everyone for the afternoon sharing circle. When it was Annalise's turn, she stood confidently, holding up her book's cover illustration. "Once," she began, her voice clear and strong, "there was a girl who thought she had to be perfect to be loved. But then she learned that being herself was enough, more than enough." The children applauded, and Annalise beamed. Outside the windows of the Empathy Academy, Chesterville continued its leisurely pace, but something fundamental had shifted. The truth had finally spoken, and for one little girl, the world was wide open once again.